Welcome to Tea and Teaching, the educational podcast you can listen to with a cup of tea. I'm Arthur Moore, and with me, as always, it's Mike Harrowell. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Arthur. How are you?
I'm really good, buddy. I'm really buzzing about this mini series coming up. I don't know about you. How you feeling about it?
Yeah, I'm good. We've learned a lot from this podcast over the last 3 years. And I'm worried that in this mini series, we're going to find out we haven't learned much, but we've just performed it.
We've just been performing at such a high level that maybe we haven't taken a step back and thought about what have we learned. And that's because, listeners, we're going to be talking about performance, learning, the difference, what's good about each of them for 3 episodes. But don't worry, Mike, you're not just having to listen to me. I'm not just having to listen to you. We've got a guest joining us. Do you want to know who it is, Mike?
I would, just put me out of my misery.
Well, you're lucky, Mike, because we have got Amarbeer Singh Gill joining us, better known in the education world as Singh. Everyone will know him as a maths teacher extraordinaire, works for Ambition Institute, huge deliverer of CPD, international educational speaker, author. I'm absolutely buzzing to have him back on the pod, Mike. We'll let him introduce himself because he does a much better job of it than we ever could. So listeners, go away, put the kettle on, get a cup of tea, get some biscuits, because we've got a mini-series coming up with Amarbeer and Gill all about performance versus learning. Welcome back to Tea and Teaching. We are lucky enough to be joined by Singh. Singh, welcome back to Tea and Teaching.
I feel like this is my 3rd time, potentially.
We've had you on, we've done a full pod with you, and we've had you on one of our kind of roaming pods a few times, actually. I think you're actually up there with the most episodes across Tea and Teaching, along with kind of Bradley Bush and Jade Pierce. So Tea and Teaching royalty we have with us.
That is exalted company, isn't it?
Yeah. For those people who didn't listen to every episode me and Mike have ever done of Tea and Teaching, do you want to give a quick introduction to who you are, Singh?
Yeah, so firstly, definitely go and listen to every episode that Arthur and Mike have done. But yes, so my name is Singh. I have a background in secondary maths, but currently work in teacher education and really got into it for a number of reasons. But the main one was sort of, I love teaching. I loved working with my students, but I was always mindful that like my hopefully positive impact was like limited to my classroom. And I always wanted to work in somewhere and have the impact wider than my own classroom or even like my school where I was based. So I got involved with Ambition Institute a few years ago. I did a master's program with them, and since 2021 I've been working with them as a teacher educator, delivering on their programs. And that forms like the majority of the work that I do. For the last academic year, I've also been working for a trust in London, Haberdashers Academy South, working across their 4 secondary schools, supporting their maths teams.
And you do yourself a disservice in your international educational speaker, author. I know you do a lot of training because you appear in lots of people's video feeds. So I think, listeners, we've got one of the greats at the moment, I've got to say. I've seen you speak at conferences across the country, Singh. It's always a pleasure. And that brings us right on to what we're going to be talking about across these episodes. We're going to be talking about performance and learning, what that means to us as teachers. But we're just going to take a step first, listeners, before we jump onto that. And Singh, what me and Mike really want to know is, why are we bad at learning stuff?
For yourself.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the question you've asked yourself, Arthur, but Mike and I, like, we're absolutely fine. No, it's a great question. And so, like, for context, there were 2 situations I would find all the time when I was teaching. The first one was, I teach students some stuff, and they in that lesson, just talk to them in that lesson, they do it pretty well, but then I try and revisit it the next lesson or the next week, and they would just struggle with things that I've just seen them do, like not that long ago, really, really well, and I just couldn't make sense of it. How is it that they've been able to do it really successfully at one point in time, and then not that much longer afterwards, they really struggle to do the exact same thing? So that was the first situation. The second situation was more so for like older, higher up the year groups, more so like year 11, 13 kids. I would have my students come to me and say, "Sir, I spent hours doing this revision. I spent like so much time doing it." They would show me their notes, and it'd be like really extensive notes, and they would say, "I just can't get it to stick. Like I spent all this time doing this and producing this, but it's just not going in. And I just thought, well, there has to be a reason, right? Like how can it be that people can spend so much time and have very little in terms of learning to show for it, but have like loads of concrete stuff to show for it? And how is it that students can do something well one day, really struggle with it after even a short delay? And that was what really sort of led me to explore this idea of like learning and performance and the relationship between them. And I think it's helpful to understand, like, to define those two things first. In that, like, when we say learning, what we mean is permanent change to knowledge or understanding, like a relatively permanent change to knowledge or understanding. So if you ask me to, if you're teaching your maths lessons, Alpha, and you say, Singh, can you show me how to add and subtract fractions? You give me some questions and I can do it at that point in time. But you ask me, a week later or even a day later and I can't do it, you probably wouldn't feel confident saying, well, Singh's learnt fractions based on like that really short performance or during initial instruction. And that's what we mean. When we say short-term performance, that's what we mean. Performance either close to or during initial instruction. This isn't to say that like learning good, performance bad. Like, this is another thing that I had to like get my head around. It's not that we want learning, we don't want performance. What we're saying is we can't see learning. I can't open up your head and see whether you've learned, fractions or like how to shoot a basketball properly, or how a particular art technique. I can't do those things. All I can do is say, well, Arthur, can you show me how you would shoot a basketball? Can you show me how you would hold a paintbrush? Or can you show me how you would add these two fractions? I have to essentially get you to do some sort of performance. And we'll explore that a bit more sort of later on. But what happens is we mistake the two things. We conflate short-term performance with like long-term learning. We've embedded it. So we'll sit there and do those fractions. Yeah, I've got it. I'm done. And we won't go back to it again. And one of the key principles of learning, you're revisiting information over time. And that's really where learning comes from. So because the signals we get from like the work we do encourage us to think, I've learned it because I can perform it, we don't go back to stuff. That performance then dips, and our like learning in inverted commas, what we'd assumed was learning, is basically lost. So I hope that's like a really nice, short, succinct answer to your question, Arthur, for why you're bad at learning.
So one thing I want to like jump at, like, can you say like we forget things, essentially, like we forget things, we come back to them, like, and what I'm wondering is, do you think sometimes because we think we've learned something, we think we don't need to revisit, and that's the same for our students? Like, do we get a bit arrogant? I can do this, therefore I don't need to prove I can do it again.
Well, I mean, this is the challenging thing, right? Like, if we take the opposite situation, like if you're sitting through and trying to answer a bunch of questions or do a performance and you're failing, like we can confidently say you haven't learned it, right? Like, if you can't do something, even in the short term, like if performance is low in the short term, you probably haven't learned it. And so what we'd assume is, well, if that's the case, then the opposite would mean learning. If short-term failure means a lack of learning, then short-term success should mean like a presence of learning. And that's the like really tricky thing, is we have to be able to perform and be successful in the short term, but we can't just assume based on that short-term measure that it's learned. So the same signals that tell us whether we are going to be successful in learning or aren't going to be successful in learning, it's the same signals. So it's really hard to like pick out. Like I can't give you ask you to do a performance and just figure out whether you've learned it or not, because I have to take account of the context. If I ask you, say, Alpha, can you show me how you ride a bike, like to figure out if you know how to ride a bike, if you've learned to ride a bike, all I can do is get you to like show me how to ride a bike. And if all I get you to is that single performance and I don't account for the context, I can come to two very different conclusions. I could either come to a conclusion that says, yeah, Arthur, you've learned how to ride that bike, or this is only one time. I don't know if you've just got lucky or if this is something you've recently learned and just about managed to get hold of, and you might not be able to do it later. I just don't know. So it's like, yeah, it's really tricky to get your head around, because it's the same thing either way, but we can get very different conclusions depending on how much of the context we like pay attention to and include or choose to ignore.
So is there a point where you said that if I see something once, that means it's been performed? It doesn't mean it's been learned. Is there a point where we can say definitively you have now learned this? Or is it just you can perform it for a longer period of time since you learned it?
I think that's part of it, right? Like, no matter how well learned certain bits of information are, there will probably come a point in time where if we just don't use it, like year after year, we will lose it, right? Like, we just will forget. Forgetting is just an inevitable part of like how we work as humans. So it might be that actually, we have learned like lots of maths between me and you, Arthur. Like, our subject knowledge of maths is probably going to be really high, probably really well learned. Mike, similarly for PE, like his subject knowledge of PE is probably going to be really well learned. Mine, on the other hand, like when I was in year 11 and I was doing my GCSE PE, that was probably pretty good then. I think I can remember. I remember body types. I remember mesomorph. Am I right? Like, is that just right? So
Yeah, that's the first one. Yeah,
Mike,
I'll give you that.
Mike looks so proud right now.
I'm really proud. I mean, that's a real achievement for a maths teacher. Anyway, sorry for the distraction, guys. So yeah, there was a point in time where that information like was learnt pretty well, but like it's gone now. I couldn't give you the other body types. Like I just don't know that information anymore, and I can't perform it. So there does come a point in time, but like what that point is, how we get there, like how long is a piece of string, is really what we're trying to figure out.
First of all, ectomorph, endomorph, saying just to put your mind at ease.
I knew it.
No, that's going to bug you.
Thank you.
Wow, Mike, you really know wow.
Amazing. I remember having this conversation around the time of flight paths, when everyone got obsessed with flight paths for assessment. And I remember the senior leader in charge of assessment at the school was at the time saying, you cannot unlearn things. So your grade can't be, I know, we were back in the days of, good old days of national curriculum grades. You can't be a 5C in term 1 and then be 4A in term 2 because you can't unlearn things. And I actually said to her, well, could you sit a GCSE physics paper now? She said, well, no. So, well, you've unlearned it, haven't you? So it is, and this brought us on, and the reason we had this conversation was in PE, we were teaching a different activity every half term. And you might have a student who had a very good level of performance in football. So they might get a very good score in their assessment in term 1.1. Term 1.2, they might go on to dance and they might not be as strong. So suddenly then that average grade has dropped. And the big conversation we had then is, well, actually we want to be assessing learning, but what we're assessing at the moment is performance. Because if you looked at all the things we want to be able to teach, the knowledge, the skills, the understanding in PE, that's going to look like, I don't know, let's say throwing. Throwing is going to look different in a number of different activities. If I'm just assessing throwing in athletics, that's me assessing that performance as opposed to that learnt skill applied, like you said, in multiple different contexts. So the discussion we always had as a PE team is how hard is that for us to assess learning in PE because it's such a holistic set of kind of knowledge and skills as opposed to that raw visual performance that you can see in our subject. And that, it's why we love our subjects, because we can teach someone something and they can do it immediately or after the lesson or the next lesson. But it's a really tough thing, isn't it, for teachers to understand? Am I assessing performance or am I assessing learning? And if learning's invisible, how do I assess it?
Well, actually, I think like your final question there is probably one that like took me a while to get my head around. Like, actually, and I remember someone saying to me, I was having a similar conversation with a colleague, and them saying that actually, saying that we never assess learning. Like, we're not really assessing. What we're doing is assessing performance, and from that, making inferences about learning. Like, what we're saying is, I've just spent 40 minutes teaching you how to add and subtract fractions, and so now you've been able to do it. Your performance is really high, but I can't make any strong inferences about learning because I've just taught you that information and you've just done it. Like a singular reference point. If I come back in 6 months' time without any additional sort of teaching or input around that topic, and I again ask you to perform, like demonstrate your knowledge or understanding of how to add and subtract fractions, and you can still do it really well, I've still assessed performance, but my inferences now change because the context of that performance is different. I'm not testing you immediately after giving you loads and loads and loads of practice and learning and teaching on it. I've tested you 6 months after that input, so I can draw different conclusions because the context has changed. So I think there's and trying to get your head around the idea of we're never actually assessing learning, we're trying to draw conclusions about it based on context. Yeah, I think it's a really tricky concept. It took me a while to get my head around as well, to be honest.
I guess the thing that's popping into my head at the moment is when you learn to drive, is that during that driving test or during your driving lessons, the assessor or the teacher is assessing your performance at those individual sets of skills or your hazard perception, thing like that. And then when you come to that final test, the whole round performance is, have you learnt to drive to a certain standard, isn't it? And again, like you said, they're pulling inferences from the performance they see on that day.
Yeah, and I think actually, things like a driving test and to us, most PE lessons are really great at helping make sense of assessment. So you gave these earlier examples of 2 different areas of PE and trying to draw conclusions about how good is a student at PE, but you've assessed them on different things, and it happens all the time, right? It happens all the time across subjects. We compare apples and oranges to come to a conclusion about fruit. It doesn't sort of make sense. Yes, a student can be strong in one area of a subject and weaker in another, but those things aren't in opposition. We're not able to make accurate judgments based on those individual topics because it's such a short-term measure.
So it's a really weird thing as teachers, isn't it, to say we can never assess learning. We can only assess performance and then use our knowledge of our subject, of that student, to make a judgment about whether something has been learnt in that moment. Again, we can't judge whether it has now been learnt forever, and maybe we never can. There's a few things, I suppose, it's like riding a bike. We had those phrases in kind of our language. We never know if something has been maybe something can't be truly learnt. It can only be performed at different stages. I don't know. Are we going too meta here, Thing?
I think it's a good question, right? At what point do we say this has been definitively learned? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know. Can you hold on a piece of information for eternity without using it on a regular basis? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that you could. So, if I think back to my old university address or my old house where I grew up in as a child, I can't remember. I can remember bits and pieces of that address. I can't, and I used it on a regular basis for the first 10, 15 years of my life where I spent my childhood. But I can't remember it now. I can remember the road. I can't remember the number. I can't remember the postcode. Similarly, my uni address, I used it for 3 or 4 years regularly. I couldn't tell you what number I lived in there. So I don't know. It's a really fair question.
Would you say that it's been learned when it becomes autonomous? So I'm going to keep pulling at the driving thread. How many times have you got in your car, driven somewhere while your mind's on something else, and got there and be like, I don't remember driving here, because it just became that kind of autonomous performance. Well, no, it's not even performance, is it? But
I think you're right. And I think actually that's probably a really good way of, in terms of what we're trying to achieve as teachers, at least, sort of philosophical debate aside, I think that's actually a really helpful way. Can we get students to the point where they can do it, pretty much all, without thinking? That's probably learned. The 3 of us, for our relative respective subjects, don't have to think particularly hard when we're doing some of those school level skills, because we've just learned it so well. Driving, we don't have to think about the route we take to school every day because it's just automatic, right? We just do it pretty unconsciously. And so, that's probably a point where we could say, this information is pretty well learned. And interestingly, when we come on to talk about some of the ways we can boost learning, it's throwing off that unconscious process. By interfering with it, you lower performance, but actually the research suggests you'll get bigger gains in learning afterwards.
Singh, I think it's fairly obvious. You're all in on this. This is your jam. You said, I went away and thought about this and thought. Do you think teachers in schools who are just wanting to teach the best they can, do they need to worry? I don't know if that's the right word. Do they need to be really thoughtful of am I teaching them to perform or am I teaching them to learn? Or does that come in more, is that a wider conversation for us to have about education? Should teachers be worrying about the big meta chat we've just had for the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm slightly biased, but I think even objectively, I would say yes. And the reason I say that is because it made me think about my practice completely differently once I'd learned about some of these things. So like that standard conversation that in the staff room of like, just taught it to them. How have they forgotten it already? Right? Like I used to say it all that I just stood in front of this kid thinking, literally just taught it to you. And it made me realize that actually it's pretty unfair on that child because like they're gonna forget, like putting aside the fact that they go through 5 or 6 different lessons in a day anyway, all of that information, even if all they had was a day of maths or they had 1 lesson of maths and nothing else, they're just not wired to retain all of that information because humans we're just not programmed like that. We're not programmed to take in vast amounts of information and just retain it indefinitely. And so it really made me stop making students feel bad for not knowing stuff, but actually it's not their fault. I feel really bad actually, like reflecting on my practice. But also, it meant I could make fundamental changes to how I was doing what I was doing. So one of the things that probably the biggest change in my practice, I stopped just going through my scheme of work. I stopped thinking, well, that's next in the scheme of work, so that's what I need to do. And that's next, and that's next, and that's next. I started to be a bit more critical about what's most helpful for my students to cover next. There is some sequencing to your curriculum, to your scheme of work. I'm not saying abandon them, but actually, if they haven't got yesterday's work to a good level, and even if they haven't got it to a good level yesterday, I don't know if they can still do it to a good level today. It's probably worth me spending a bit more time going through that. And what I found was, the thing I was mindful of going into it is I'm going to end up playing catch up. I'm pushing my scheme of work back and back and back, and so I'm going to play catch up at some point. It's going to catch up with me. What I found was normally what would happen is when I move on the scheme of work and I try and build on something I taught last week, last month, they would have forgotten. So I would spend that lesson having to reteach something I've already taught, and I would end up getting backed up anyway. And I found out I was having to do that less often. Actually, because I was spending more time going backwards and revisiting stuff, when I got onto stuff where students had to go backwards and had to tie into prior knowledge, it was their foundation was a lot more stable, a lot more established, so I could actually spend more time going into that new stuff. So whilst I sacrificed it in the short term, actually, over the lengths of scales of time that we're working on, terms and years, it pays off, and you don't have to make that sort of decision around I'm going to lose out or they're going to miss out on learning something.
I feel like Singh, Mike, has absolutely perfectly previewed what we're going to be talking in the next couple of episodes of this chat about performance versus learning. The last thing I'm going to pick up is because I remember saying to students I've taught you this, so why can't you still remember it?
Yeah.
I'm putting the onus, looking back at that, I've done everything perfectly. It must be your fault. Which is obviously wrong. I'd love to go back and talk to past Arthur about that, amongst other things. So we're going to come back to this conversation, listeners, in part 2, where we're going to be talking about what we've talked about here, what that means for schools and for SLTs and for heads of departments and heads of years. And then later on in this mini-series, we'll go even more on kind of what it means into your classroom practice. So until next time, until we come together again, us three, Mike, what a pleasure it has been spending some time with you as always.
And you, Arthur, and thank you, Singh, for giving us that insight into the comparisons of learning versus performance.
Thanks for having me on. Let me try that again. Thanks for having me on, guys. It's been a pleasure.
You performed that perfectly, Singh. Listeners, we'll see you next time.